Welcome to the 28 Minutes of Sanity disclaimer. Paul and I have been doing this podcast for a few months now, and we're having a blast. We're really thankful for the great guests that have agreed to come on. We're always on the lookout for people who have something interesting to say that is connected to the Christian worldview. And at times we do wade into subjects that might be uncomfortable or controversial. So just want to remind you that anything our guests say may not reflect the views of Heartland Church or Heartland's leadership. As always, if you have a question or a concern, feel free to reach out to us. The coffee's on us, and we thank you for listening. Welcome to the 28 Minutes of Sanity podcast. I'm JJ. Paul's with us today. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can at 28min of sanity. Send us an email, 28minutesofsanity@gmail.com. This is the podcast where we talk about ideas and issues connected to the Christian worldview. I'm very excited today to have Dr. Stephen Meyer joining us. Dr. Meyer is with the Discovery Institute. And I think we'll just start off. Dr. Meyer, would you take just a few minutes and tell us a bit about your story? And if you, to my knowledge, you've got 3 published books. If you would reference your first couple of books and summarize what those are. And then in a bit, I want to do a deep dive into the current book that you have. But if you would just take a few minutes to introduce yourself, please.
Well, I work for the Discovery Institute. I direct a program here called the Center for Science and Culture. I've long been interested in issues at the intersection of science and philosophy, which puts me firmly within the framework of your interest in worldview. Mm-hmm. I started out as a geophysicist in my career and fairly early on made kind of a change of direction. And after 4 or 5 years in industry, I went and worked I went to do a PhD in the history and philosophy of science, and specifically focusing on the subject of origin of life biology. And I became very interested in the topic of biological origins and specifically the origin of the first life. And after finishing the PhD, I taught at Whitworth University for 12 years in the philosophy department, and then eventually came to work here at the Discovery Institute full-time. And I've been here for full-time for 20 years and 25 years in some affiliated capacity or another. My first book was an extension of some of the things I'd been thinking about during my PhD, and that is the book called Signature in the Cell, which is, the subtitle was DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. So my story really started with a conference in the early part of my career. I was working in Dallas, Texas, in the field of exploration geophysics. And one of the things I was doing was processing seismic data. So it was an early form of information technology. And I attended a conference about the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of the human mind, the origin and nature of the human mind. And it was a conference that was divided between scientists and philosophers who were theists, people who believed in God on the one hand, and materialists or atheists on the other. And they were debating these big questions of where things came from those 2 distinct philosophical points of view. I found it absolutely fascinating. And in the panel on the origin of life, I was especially intrigued as I learned that leading people in the field of origin of life biology, or sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, had all kind of recognized that they didn't have an answer to the question of the origin of life, the question of how did the first life arise from simpler prebiotic chemicals or chemicals in a prebiotic soup or prebiotic ocean by purely undirected chemical processes. How do you get from chemistry to the first living cell? And the big problem that these scientists encountered was the problem of the origin of the information that's stored in the DNA molecule. The real question, the proximate question, was how do you get from chemistry to code? Because it turns out that you can't build a cell without DNA and the proteins that it makes. And so that raised a question, well, where did that information with the instructions for building the proteins come from? And in our experience, information is something that only comes from a mind. And so some of the scientists on the panel were actually suggesting that the scientists had stumbled across evidence of what they called an intelligent cause of life. Whereas others were steadfastly resisting that idea and saying, yes, it's true, we don't have an answer now, but we need to keep looking for a materialistic evolutionary explanation. And I was fascinated by this debate.
At that point, if I could interrupt, when you went to the debate, what perspective did you bring? What perspective were you carrying when you first heard that, or maybe not first, but when you heard them discussing that issue? Were you a Christian at that point, or a theist, or what presuppositions did you bring to that debate?
Well, I was at that point a recently settled theist and indeed Christian. I'd had a kind of long conversion experience, or a tortuous period of deliberation, and lots of doubts and wrestling and things of that sort. And it was in about that time in my early 20s, I was finally settled in the conviction that Christianity was true. Mm-hmm. But as to the question of origins, I'd had two different science majors, physics and geology, and I was pretty comfortable with what I'd been told about, some form of God-guided evolution was probably the answer. So I probably have been considered a theistic evolutionist at that point, but I hadn't thought about it all that much. And I was immediately intrigued with the idea that we might be looking at evidence of design in life, but also not quite convinced by the arguments that I'd heard. So after the conference happened, that one of the scientists who had presented on the theistic side for this idea that life gave evidence of an intelligent cause, happened to live in Dallas. And I started visiting him after hours, talking with him, sometimes late into the night, about these ideas. He'd written a book called The Mystery of Life's Origin with two other co-authors. His name was Charles Thaxton. And so I had a year where I was having these intense conversations, reading a whole lot about this question of the origin of life. And so by the time I was accepted to a graduate program in England, I had a real clear idea of what I wanted to work on.
Okay. And can you expand real briefly? You mentioned the phrase chemistry to code. And it's been a while since I read Signature in the Cell, but that's kind of the core of that book. If somebody were to say, explain that terminology, do you have like an analogy or a simple way of helping people understand what you're talking about with that phrase?
Well, maybe the best way to get at that is to just tell the story of what the scientists themselves discovered. We all know the story of Watson and Crick and their discovery in 1953 of the structure of the DNA molecule. But what I found fascinating as I got into the history of what's called molecular biology, that by the late 50s, Francis Crick had come to the realization that DNA didn't just have this beautiful double helix structure, but that within that double helix, there were chemical subunits that were functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or maybe like the zeros and ones in a section of software. And that is to say that the function of DNA is not a product of its chemical properties, but rather of the arrangement of specific elements of the molecule that are functioning like alphabetic characters. And that these they're called the bases, or the nucleotide bases. And Crick suggested that it was the specific arrangement of those bases expressed in accord with an independent symbol convention, which was later discovered and is now known as the genetic code, that information or instructions for building proteins are transmitted within the cell. So you have DNA storing information, and then a whole system of other molecules, mostly proteins, processing and expressing that information, and then that information being used to build proteins and protein machines that keep the cell alive. And so the so-called simple cell, as it was referred to in the 19th century, turned out to be not to be simple at all. It turned out to house a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system where the information was both stored and expressed digitally or alphabetically or typographically as precise sequences of chemicals that were functioning as symbolic characters. And so this is just an absolutely fascinating discovery. And it raised the question of, well, not where is the information in DNA stored, not what's the structure of the DNA molecule, not even how the information is expressed. By the mid-60s, people had pretty much mapped out good answers to all those questions. It raised the question of where did the information come from? And that's a puzzler because in our experience, information comes from a mind. In fact, Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Richard Dawkins, the great proponent of neo-Darwinism, has acknowledged that the gene code or the information in the genes is uncannily computer-like. That suggests perhaps that there was a master programmer for life, and certainly a huge puzzle for people trying to explain how undirected chemical reactions could have produced the specificity of arrangement of all those chemical characters that allow the DNA molecule to store the instructions for building complex proteins and protein machines that are crucial to all of cellular life.
So that gets to kind of jumping way ahead in what I'm planning to ask you to, but the basic presuppositions of how we do science, right? There's one assumption that science needs to be naturalistic in nature, that you have to sort of rule out the idea of an immaterial mind ahead of time, whereas what was observed and what you're observing is, if you rule that out, there's nowhere to go. You have to at least consider that a mind may have been at play. Is that it? Is that a decent way?
Right. It immediately raised a question of the methods of science, but also the rules of science.
Mm-hmm.
There is an unspoken and sometimes spoken convention in the sciences called methodological naturalism that says if you're going to be a scientist, you must explain everything by reference to undirected material processes. But we know that rule breaks down in some areas in certain special sciences or forensic sciences in our ordinary experience. If you go into the British Museum and encounter the Rosetta Stone, and you see those etchings in 3 different styles on that rock, you'll quickly discern what the archaeologists discerned is that there was a scribe that was responsible for those etchings. There are 3 different languages saying, repeating the same account of events. We know from our experience that information arises from a mind. Some people have proposed other causes, but they've turned out not to be very plausible. And so this was the argument of my book in Signature in the Cell, is that when we encounter information, especially when we encounter it in a digital or alphabetic form, and we trace it back to its source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of computer code or even information embedded in a radio signal, information is invariably the product of intelligent agency. And so that would naturally lead one to infer that the information present in DNA is the product of intelligent agency, except there is this rule that says you can't consider that. And so the question is, do you go with the rule or do you go with the evidence and what it naturally would lead to based on our uniform and repeated experience, which is otherwise the basis of all scientific reasoning? And what I argue in Signature in the Cell is that we should have a more open philosophy of science, that we should infer, as many sciences do, to the best explanation. We should make inferences to the best explanation from the evidence and not limit the range of explanations or explanatory hypotheses we're willing to consider in advance of the inquiry. So we need to let the evidence determine the outcome, not an arbitrary rule telling us what hypotheses are or are not going to be considered.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That that takes my mind again to a place I was going to go later in the interview, but I think I'm just going to go there now. Now, full disclosure, I'm only 100 pages into Return of the God hypothesis, so I apologize that I haven't fully done my homework. I hope I'm not downgraded too much.
No worries.
So recently, our family had to drive from Nebraska to Texas and back, so I thought I'd go for the Cliff Notes, and I listened to your interview with Peter Robinson, and you talked there about you talked about how science advanced. I'm trying to keep this all straight in my head to connect it to what you just said, but science was able to advance when we were able to do things like astronomy, where we would actually look at the evidence versus assuming that. I think the example you gave was planetary motion, that there had been this assumption that planetary motion was following certain laws of geometry. And then because of the Christian worldview, we said, no, we need to actually go look at what the planets are actually doing versus what we assume they're doing. Am I making too big of a leap to say that when you talk about DNA sort of not obeying methodological naturalism, is that a similar concept that we're talking about, where we either
in a way, but
okay,
only insofar as in both cases you have an arbitrary set of assumptions or rules limiting your thinking about how best to explain what you're seeing. The argument I was making in the first portion of Return of the God hypothesis was that it was that Judeo-Christian and indeed biblical assumptions about the nature of God, the nature of the human mind, and the nature of nature critically contributed to the rise of what we call modern science, certainly the form of science that arose in the West. And that was, and there were many such assumptions. One was the intelligibility of nature, the idea that we could look at nature and get it to, and if we studied it carefully, we could get nature to reveal its secrets, that there was an order implicit in nature that we could perceive and understand if we studied it, and that we were capable of doing that because nature was the product of a rational mind, and it expressed a rational order and design, and that the same rational mind who made nature made our minds in a way that allowed us to perceive and understand the rationality and design present in nature. Because we have reason, we can understand the reason built into nature. And there were other assumptions. One was the idea that there's an order to nature, but also the order is contingent on the will of the creator, that it could have been otherwise. One way of ordering the planets was the idea that they might be going around in perfect circles. But another orderly pattern that might be exhibited by those orbits might be an ellipse. The Greeks had assumed that the order that seemed most rational to them was necessarily the kind of order that should be built into nature. They believed there was an underlying logos that governed everything. And so they assumed that the most perfect form of motion was a circle, and therefore that the planets were moving in circular orbits. They couldn't quite get all the data to line up with that, so they came up with circles within circles within circles, so-called epicycles. And Kepler came along and said, well, God is a God of order. He's a God of mathematical order. He was a Neoplatonist Christian, but that doesn't mean that God necessarily had to build the orbits in perfect circles. He might have used another beautiful form of motion. Turned out that the data conform more closely to the idea of an elliptical orbit. So part of the scientific revolution was the idea that, yes, God made the world in an orderly way, but he made it according to his will and pleasure, and he could have made it differently. So we need to go and look and see how he made it, not assume or try to deduce that from some sort of philosophical first principles.
So that seems, again, I'm trying to play mental catch up with how these ideas fit together, but when you frame it that way, so frequently the criticism is, well, if we assume theism, the the common term, that's a science stopper. Like, well, that will end our curiosity because we can just say God did it and move on and not study. Whereas the way
exactly opposite.
You just framed it, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. The science is theism, or belief in a rational creator, was the science starter. There's a wonderful book by the Baylor and formerly University of Washington historian of science, Rodney Stark, titled "For the Glory of God," published with Princeton University Press. And he shows that the motivation for science was to give glory to God by revealing the often mathematical forms of order that were inherent in natural processes. And this was clearly part of what animated, for example, Sir Isaac Newton in his great work, the Principia, the principles of mathematics that were expressed in what he called natural laws. And so that theistic belief, interestingly, Newton also made design arguments. He made a beautiful design argument in the theological epilogue to the Principia called the General Scholium, where he argued that the law of gravity could explain why the planets stay in a stable orbit, why they are maintained in a stable set of orbits that we call the solar system. But he said that the law of gravity can explain that, but it can't explain how the planets first acquired the positions that they have that enabled for that solar system to be established. And so he argued that initial fine-tuning of the planetary positions was evidence of an intelligent and powerful being. So you have, right from the very beginning in the history of science, people bringing biblical and Judeo-Christian presuppositions to the study of nature and a religious motive as well. But then also those same scientists, when carefully perceiving and studying the natural world, also argued that they were seeing evidence of the design of such an intelligent and powerful being.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to come back to some of that in a few minutes, but
really, actually, my long answer didn't get to your main point.
Okay.
Sorry,
that's all right.
That led to a great flowering of scientific activity. Newton, who was profoundly motivated by his religious beliefs, invented the calculus, the binomial theorem, made fundamental contributions to optics, developed the laws of motion. He developed the first comprehensive or universal theory of gravitation, and made many, many other fundamental contributions to science from a explicitly theological motivation. So, and he also posited theological explanations for certain phenomena as well. None of that stopped him from doing good science. It was a science starter, not a science stopper.
Right. And so you can see just from that one example how that particular criticism just should be, for a thoughtful person, should be a non-starter. The idea that if you bring theistic assumptions, science cannot advance. And
all these great early scientists, Kepler was famous for saying that we natural philosophers, which is what scientists were called at the time, have the high calling of thinking God's thoughts after him. Robert Boyle was an explicitly motivated scientist, an explicitly theologically motivated scientist as well. There were many, many examples of this.
Yeah, and I think you've written about it. I think others have written about it. Reveals God has created a universe designed for discovery. We have before us the ability to continue to discover and enjoy discovering over and over and over again, which implies that God set that out there for us to do that and to enjoy it and do it rigorously and improve it over time. I'd like to. I've got some kind of cultural type questions I'm going to get to shortly, but I don't want to give your newest book, Return of the God Hypothesis, real short shrift. We've already touched on some of this, but the subtitle, 3 Scientific Discoveries That Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. If somebody's looking to pick that book up, Could you, again, you've kind of touched on it, but could you summarize the three discoveries just in thumbnail form for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've kind of been talking about this history of science, and maybe it's good to put the three discoveries in a bit of a historical and narrative context. The book tells a story of the rise of modern science within an explicitly theistic and Judeo-Christian context in Western Europe, and then how that there was a philosophical shift in the 19th century so that science was increasingly seen as supporting not a theistic worldview, but a materialistic or naturalistic worldview. And so coming into the 20th century, increasingly the worldview of scientific naturalism or scientific materialism became dominant, where materialism is the idea that matter and energy are the things from which everything else came, and beyond them, before them, there is nothing else. There is no creator or intelligence of any kind. But starting in the 1920s and over the last century, there have been three major discoveries that are, I think, challenging that scientific materialist perspective, and again, pointing to the existence of a transcendent intelligence or creator. And the first of those discoveries is the discovery from cosmology and astronomy that, as best we can tell, the universe, the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy, had a beginning before which there was no matter or energy to do the causing. And so the idea of positing a materialistic explanation for the origin of the universe becomes increasingly problematic with these discoveries. The second big discovery is that from the very beginning of the universe, the basic physical parameters, the laws of physics, and the configuration and parameters or the configuration and features of matter have been very finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. That is to say, if any of those parameters, those physical parameters, were a little bit different, if the forces were a little stronger, a little weaker, if the masses of the elementary particles a little lighter, a little heavier, if the expansion rate of the universe or the force pushing it outward were a little different one way or another, then life would not be possible. And many physicists have, from those really surprising data, inferred or concluded that there must have been a fine tuner, an intelligence responsible for getting those parameters just right so that life would eventually arise. And then the third big discovery is that inside living cells, this is the one we've talked about a bit about already, we have discovered that even the simplest living cells are hardly simple homogeneous globs of undifferentiated protoplasm, as one 19th century scientist, Thomas Huxley, said, but instead they are chock full of information and little miniature machines, nanomachinery, both of which give powerful evidence of design. Again, the presence of information, I think, being the most decisive of those indicators, since from our experience, information in a digital or alphabetic form always arises from an intelligent source. So we have evidence of information in living systems, suggesting the activity of a master programmer for life. So those are the big three. The universe had a beginning. It's been finely tuned from the beginning. And since the beginning, there have been infusions of information into our biosphere, making new forms of life possible.
Okay, the big three. And your book's been out now, this one that we're discussing, copyright 2021, so it's been out a while. Could you, as you have put your ideas out there, is there a critique that that has come up either with the highest frequency or the greatest sophistication, that something that you hear over and over and over that you would like to take an opportunity to respond to at this point? Or is it multiple? Or how has the feedback or the criticism gone since you released the book?
Well, I would say that there's been a smattering of things that have, I think, let me just share a few of the critiques, and then people can decide how formidable they think they are.
Right.
One critique was from a biologist named Darrell Falk, who argued that he argued that in my critique of these chemical evolutionary ideas about the origin of life, I had failed to address a recent proposal that he thought had some considerable merit. Unfortunately, I don't think Professor Falk read the book very carefully, because I specifically addressed the very idea that he said he thought had merit and provided a critique of it. It wasn't even the first time I'd critiqued the idea. It had to do with something called the RNA world. And I showed in the book that attempts to, the RNA world is the idea that life first arose not as a DNA, not from DNA molecules, but from RNA molecules that could copy themselves. And I showed in the book that attempts to simulate the origin of life using RNA molecules, trying to get them to copy themselves, have been singularly unsuccessful, and that in the best of cases, we've been able to design an RNA molecule ourselves that can copy about 10% of itself, but not the whole. And we have, in any case, had to arrange the information carrying parts of the molecule ourselves to get it to achieve that level of replicability. And so the simulations are actually demonstrating the need for information and the need for a mind to generate the information. He cited some experimental work by a scientist named Gerald Joyce that he thought was showing promise for solving the problem. But I showed, first of all, that I had critiqued that idea already, and secondly, that Professor Joyce was doing what everyone else was doing, which was providing a lot of investigator assistance to shape the molecules. And so he was actually simulating intelligent design. There's a lot more to it than that. And there's an extensive response to that critique on the website for the book. There have been a couple of other critiques. One, that there are some new cosmological models that I didn't specifically address in the book. I will probably address those in an epilogue to the book. But one of those was from the great English physicist Roger Penrose, and he had an idea about what he called a cyclical conformal cosmology. This was an alternative to the idea that the universe had a beginning, and it was the idea that the universe is expanding outward now, but then at a certain point, out of a little patch of that universe, there'll be another universe there will be an outgrowth of another universe, and then another universe, and another universe. So we can still think of the universe as a sort of a system of infinitely expanding universes, giving rise to more infinitely expanding universes. But I pointed out in a radio discussion of this with a physicist who's raised this with me, that this idea really only works if Penrose posits a special kind of physical field that has attributes that no other known physical fields have, and instead has attributes that we associate only with intelligent agency. So you can get rid of the God hypothesis if and only if you posit a physical field that has godlike powers, in particular, the ability to become activated at a specific point at a specific time, and to cause a reduction in what's called entropy, a reduction in disorder spontaneously at the right time and at the right place. That's something that minds can do, but physical fields, gravitational fields, electromagnetic fields, they don't work that way. They have effect universally across wide spaces and times, and they don't get turned on at just the right time or place. So there've been a number of critiques like that, and I think we've responded fairly effectively, showing that they don't really, either the ideas, the scientific ideas postulated don't solve the problem in the case of the origin of life, or the ones that are postulated may only solve the problem, but the expense of postulating something that actually ends up sounding an awful lot like God, as well as the God I posit in the book.
Okay. If Dr. Meyer, if I could move on, you wrote I read something of yours recently in, I printed the article and forgot to bring it in, but I think from the American Mind, and I think that's the name of the website, and it's you responding to some things that Andrew Klavan had written, and it's basically a critique of scientism. And what you wrote there felt to me really, really practical. Could you just give us a quick definition when we use the term scientism? What are we talking about, and then why is that of such concern? Can you respond to that?
Well, Andrew Klavan has written a really interesting book about the English Romantic poets and how they were, with the artistic imagination, attempting to restore to Western thinking or Western awareness they were attempting to restore an awareness of the reality of a transcendent creator behind nature. And so in a way, it's very interesting parallel to what I am doing and what many of my colleagues are doing by looking at nature from a scientific standpoint and suggesting that it needs it to fully explain its origin, there needs to be reference to an external mind. And the English Romantic poets were in some ways doing the same thing, but using the artistic imagination more than a formal scientific analysis of nature to get to that conclusion. It's a beautiful book that he's come out with, the Truth and the Beauty, I think it's called.
Okay.
Anyway, so he wrote a piece in this at the American Mind about the book and some of the ideas in it. And they asked me if I'd write a response because I'd also blurbed the book. And so I did, and described some of the developments in science that are also challenging the materialism that was first arising in Western thought around the beginning of the 19th century. And so Klavan is, because he's also a humanist and a writer and a man of letters, is very concerned that to challenge the idea of scientism, the idea that science provides the sole framework for understanding and for knowledge. There are other forms of knowledge besides scientific knowledge, certainly. My main focus has been challenging materialism, which is closely related to scientism, because if you define science as providing only the enterprise by which you must explain things only by reference to materialistic processes or entities, then if you affirm scientism and you have that definition of science, then you also end up being a materialist. So the two ideas are closely related, and I lent my voice in support to Klavan's critique of scientism and materialism in this short piece I wrote in response to a very reflective article that he had written at the American Mind.
And having said that, can you maybe give us an example or two of why the concern with scientism? What are the day-to-day effects if a culture embraces scientism as incorporates into their worldview? Why is there cause for concern there?
Well, because scientism is closely associated with materialism. Most people who say that, I think almost all people who say that science provides the only framework for understanding things are also functional materialists, because they have in mind a definition of science that would preclude any appeal to mind or intelligence or creativity. And so scientism then necessarily ends up advancing a materialistic worldview and ideology. I think that worldview has many deleterious consequences, not least for our understanding of human beings and human nature. One very crass materialistic idea is that everything that we do is programmed by mindless materialistic processes, and even our thoughts are the product of the chemistry at work in our brains, so that we don't have any kind of moral or even intellectual responsibility. We're not responsible for our thoughts. We're not really using reason. We think what we're programmed to think, and this leads to a denial of moral responsibility. It leads to a crisis of epistemology or knowledge. If we only think what we're programmed to think, how can we be confident that we're using reason to come to good conclusions? We'd rather just think what we're programmed to think. Materialism is also given rise to, for example, a denial of the sanctity of human life, because the whole debate about about abortion, for example, is deeply influenced by underlying assumptions, of worldview assumptions. On one side, you have people who think that the fetus is a collection of cells and tissues, and it has no intrinsic dignity, precisely because they are at bottom functional materialists. So I think a materialistic worldview has a lot of downstream consequences for many, many issues in the culture and in life. Another huge one, which we're seeing everywhere, and is very tragic, is the kind of nihilistic perspective that many young people fall into. And this results in teen depression and anxiety, and even near epidemic levels of suicide. And very oftentimes, the teen suicides are occurring in very affluent families or communities among kids that are basically having an existential crisis. They're in angst, and or at the college level, there's a famous professor from the University of Texas who said that the more the universe seems comprehensible, meaning to our science, the more it seems pointless. And that materialistic perspective has inevitably trended towards a kind of nihilism that has I think deeply affected many people's sense of meaning and purpose in life, and was sometimes with tragic consequences. So the old saw, ideas have consequences, is really true, and materialism is an idea that is deeply rooted in the culture. The idea that matter and energy are the ultimate things from which everything else comes. We can explain everything by matter and energy, molecules in motion. And when we look at the world that way, it's hard to believe in something like the intrinsic dignity of a human being, universal human rights or equality, or the sanctity of life, or meaning to human life.
Yeah, and if, as a pastor, if somebody comes to me dealing with the very struggles that you just talked about, if there's a worldview that precludes on the front end me telling someone you're created in God's image, you're created for a purpose, you were loved by God, if our worldview doesn't allow me to say that, I can't offer that person a lot of hope, right?
Well, the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre realized this, and I was taking a philosophy class in college and encountered his thought, and the professor summarized his key ideas that without an infinite reference point, nothing finite has any lasting meaning. Without an infinite and personal reference point, nothing can mean anything to a rock or to an atom or to a quark or to a DNA molecule. Things only mean things to persons. And if ultimate reality isn't personal, if we weren't the product of a personal creator, and if there's no possibility of encountering such a person upon our death, it's hard to say that our human life will have any ultimate meaning if there's no person to do the valuing, to whom we can mean something. And similarly, I guess that's the key idea. And I think many of the great atheist philosophers have recognized this. This is why Sartre talked about anguish, forlornness, and despair, that the death of God that Nietzsche discussed was not a happy thing. It was something that left the human race orphaned and destined to what Bertrand Russell describes as the heat death of the universe. Eventually everything will wind down, and there will be no one to whom anything can mean anything, and so life will ultimately be meaningless. There's a famous passage from Russell where he says that the greatest achievements of the noonday, all the noonday brightness of human achievement will dissipate in this great heat death eventually, and we can't possibly consider anything that we will achieve in this life to have any lasting meaning, given that materialistic worldview, which does inexorably lead to a kind of nihilism in one's personal reflection.
So, given that, I've got a couple. If you have time, I got a couple of questions. But I often, when we interview people, I close with this question. But how do you you're swimming upstream. You appear to be in the scientific minority. I find what you say quite persuasive, but how, given the waters you swim in, how do you stay optimistic day to day and month to month that what you're doing matters?
Well, maybe for me, I have a sense that, first of all, we're making great progress. There's a huge network of scientists who are interested in these ideas and increasingly willing to speak out about them. I was really pleased to get a lot of terrific endorsements for the book from some high-powered scientists around the world, including a number of people who held endowed chairs in various fields of science at major research universities. So I don't think we're quite as outnumbered as many people assume based on media reports or public spokesmen for science that are advancing the new atheism or scientific atheism of various kinds. But I guess for me personally, the God hypothesis is definitely supported by the evidence. But for me, belief in God is more than just a hypothesis. I have a sense of His presence in my life, and I have the comfort of knowing that I'm only called to bear witness to what I think is true and to make the best case for it, and that I am not really responsible for the outcome of that and how many people do or don't come to accept the point of view that I'm advocating. So, but I am very bullish about what we call the intelligent design movement. The pace at which new talent is being attracted to our ranks is quite exciting, and the research projects and the research, what we were talking about earlier, the way in which a belief in a designing intelligence or a creator is actually a science starter, I think is being borne out in work that we have been associated with, either by providing funding support or just some of our scientists doing the work. So it's just a very exciting endeavor and a very exciting network of people to be part of. And so we're seeing lots of progress in that. And that definitely keeps you on the sunny side of things.
Well, that's good to hear. Connected to that, one thing I wanted to ask you is, what counsel a high school student, a college student with a degree of scientific aptitude, cares about science or ideas in general, do you have any specific counsel for a young person who does have some scientific aptitude?
Well, one thing might be to apply to our summer seminar at some point. We get a lot of really bright young people coming to Seattle every summer for an intensive 10-day seminar with many of our best scientists. And that's a great way to network and connect and learn more about the evidence for intelligent design, but also many of the other key issues that arise as you think about science and worldview. I think for a young person who wants to make a contribution to this sort of area of study, I would say definitely challenge yourself. Take the most difficult courses of science study that you can. If you're interested in biology, take a little physics alongside and do get a little biophysics, molecular biology. Take the hard stuff, and then get into apply to an elite graduate program and do really good science, but also connect to other people who are thinking the way you might be thinking or might be attracted to this way of thought. So, but then there's also, we also advise people, sometimes it's not so smart to share all your views too early in your career, because there is a bit of a cancel culture in science around these issues too. So we discuss a lot of that at our summer seminar, both the substance of the science, but also the sociology of the current scientific world and how to make your way in it and make a difference.
So if somebody hears that specifically, how the summer seminar, it's Discovery Institute, correct?
Exactly. There's information about it on our website at the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute.
Okay. And the web address is?
Discovery.org.
Discovery.org. If they go there, they can easily find more information about that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Dr. Meyer, I appreciate your time. I have one question that did not fit in the flow, but I'm going to kick myself if I don't ask. I think it was in December, or I think it happened sometime last year, but a lot of people that I'm close to are very interested in the things that Jordan Peterson has to say. And he tweeted out something that got me excited, because every time I hear him talk, he's got these great insights, and he typically credits them to the evolutionary story. And he seemed openly intrigued by your ideas. And I read a brief article about that. Did that go anywhere? Did you have a chance to interact with him, or is there any more to that story that you'd care to share?
Well, a little bit. He apparently tweeted out that he had rarely read a book about he said, I think it was he rarely read a book where he'd learned so much about a topic about which he knew so little, or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And he also tweeted out to some of his followers asking whether or not the mathematical critique of the creative power of mutation and natural selection, which is a central part of my second book, Darwin's Doubt, and an argument that I reprised in Return of the God Hypothesis, whether that mathematical critique of the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism had merit. And a couple people wrote some dismissive comments, no, that's been debunked or something. And they wrote some specific, a semi-specific kind of reply trying to debunk it. And it opened up the possibility of a counter tweet. And so I don't do much on Twitter, but that night, since Peterson had raised the issue and it had created a bit of a buzz, I wrote back a tweet sort of in 252 characters or whatever you get, explaining the essence of the mathematical argument all over again, and also in the process sort of refuting or replying to the person who was dismissive about it in response to Jordan's original tweet. So I was also encouraged that he was A, complimentary about the book, B, that he was reading it, and that his general direction, I mean, he's on a really interesting trajectory as far as just wrestling with the great questions. And I would by now, if he's not already a theist, he's pretty close. I think he's gone from simply believing that the biblical stories embody a great deal of psychological wisdom to in his own way of framing it. I think he does. It sounds like he does believe in God now. So I think it's a pretty interesting journey he's been on.
Yeah, I would share, just kind of watching what he says publicly and how open he is. It's, if nothing else, it's refreshing, but encouraging. And so
absolutely refreshing. Yeah. He's a very authentic guy, and he's wrestling with the big questions in an authentic way. So I appreciate him very much.
Right. Well, Dr. Meyer, I appreciate that. And I would just want to remind our listeners, I think, to pray for Dr. Peterson and for you and the work that you're doing. As we close out here, I just want to say thank you so much for your time today and the work that you're doing. And we appreciate you being on the program today. I always try to offer any of our guests a chance. You mentioned discovery.org. Do you have any other Twitter handle or anything else that you'd like to, if people want to connect?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The thing that the site I typically direct people to is the book website, which is returnofthegodhypothesis.com. It has debates, op-ed articles, longer technical scientific articles, animations of all those cool miniature machines and the digital code and things we've been talking about, as well as recent interviews of various kinds. So there's just a trove of material there that people are interested in this subject of what science has to say about the possible existence of a designing intelligence or indeed God. That's a great place to start an investigation.
Okay. Well, we'll definitely direct people there. Dr. Meyer, thank you so much for your time today. It's really been a blessing. We've really enjoyed visiting with you. And I just want to thank our listeners for joining us. This has been the 28 Minutes of Sanity podcast. We'll see you soon. Thanks.